Coming up, the effect of the 60s on today.
Part of the anti-establishment feeling of the 60s produced the National Lampoon and Spy and David Letterman and all of this, irony industrial complex.
Writer Kurt Andersen discusses his time at Spy and New York magazines and the grand bargain of the 1960s. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Thank you so much for being here. And I'm so delighted to be here with Kurt Andersen. So Kurt and I first met about 30 years ago, and at the time, Kurt was the architecture critic for Time magazine. Then he went on to be the co-founder of Spy magazine, one of the great magazine sensations of the era. Then he went on to be the editor of New York magazine. Then he went on to be a kind of media entrepreneur. Then he has written 3 novels. Then he created a radio program, Studio 360, which is a tremendously successful show that I'm sure many of you have heard of. So Kurt is
Unable to keep a job.
unable to, he is protean, was the word I was looking for. As Lena Dunham wants to be, Kurt is, if not certainly a voice of our generation.
And I keep my clothes on most of the time.
That's the show we haven't seen yet. So, Kurt, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So, something that you and I have talked about in the past is that so many people from our mini generation, we were born in 1954, who are old enough to have been deeply shaped by the 60s, that sense of the imperative of doing justice, but too young to really have been part of the 60s, therefore were witnesses to it, became journalists. So could you talk a little bit about how, if at all, that shaped the fact that that's what you chose to do?
Sure. I think that's exactly right, and I've often thought, thinking about generations and what they mean and generational cohorts, that this sub-cohort, the younger half of the baby boomers, are in so many ways distinctly different in these ways you're describing of this youthful commitment to justice than our immediate elders. As a high school student, I was writing, what I imagined in Omaha, Nebraska in the early 1970s were truth-telling editorials and columns in the daily newspaper, in the high school newspaper.
Were you the editor of the school paper?
I was not the editor. I was one of the editors.
I see.
One of my first of many failures. And it was the late 60s and early 70s, and indeed, I thought I was doing justice and saying that we live in a racist community because there are no black people in this high school of 2,200 and so forth. So that's who I was, and I went to college imagining myself as a young lefty. But then, as you know, by the time we got to college, the anti-war movement was winding down because the war was winding down. The draft had effectively ended, and the next era had begun. And the key moment for me, although I still certainly academically wrote a left-wing honors thesis and everything, but I had nevertheless made this decision, and it was a very clear decision early on in my college career. Am I going to write for the Harvard Crimson, or am I going to write for the Harvard Lampoon? I chose the Lampoon, both because it was 1973 instead of 1968, and because I decided that's more who I am than somebody who would have written for the Harvard Crimson. That form of truth-telling was more my cup of tea than the more earnest kind.
The more satirical sense
Correct.
of a kind of more distant take on the world as opposed to the kind of more angry, emotional, direct, throttling the world by the collar or something like that.
Yeah.
Was Time magazine your first journalistic employer?
No, I wrote, my first job was writing for the Today Show, actually, writing for Gene Shalit, that people of a certain age will remember. It was a great first job, and he enabled me to publish my first book, and it was a fantastic apprenticeship. And then I wrote for Time magazine.
Yeah. And so, and at Time, your brief was much more culture and aesthetics.
No, actually, originally, I being, uppity, I thought, oh, I'm going to come here, and they're going to make me a critic. And if they said, no, you're going to write about national affairs and crime and politics, and that's what I did for the first 3 or 4 years, 3 or 4 years I was there. Yeah.
And was that a good apprenticeship?
Fantastic apprenticeship, and it was at a moment at time when it was still there were no uncertainty about its future and
Right.
future of magazines or anything else, and it was trying to become great. It had a series of great editors that really wanted it to be more consequential and than it had been, and it was a fantastic time to work there and a great apprenticeship.
It must be hard for you to explain to your two daughters that Time magazine occupied such an incredibly powerful place in the culture, not a million years ago, but when you were writing for it.
Well, explaining to my children that subways didn't used to be air conditioned, that all the versions of the 19th century that I feel as though I inhabited, sure. So then I did that for a few years, and then they allowed me to be the architecture and design critic, and then my fellow Time Inc. friend, Graydon Carter, and I decided to start this magazine.
So let me ask you about SPY, and I don't know, many of you may remember it. I mean, I wrote for Kurt at SPY. That's more or less when we first met, and it really was a tremendously important magazine. But talk a little bit about the kind of balance between ironic, detached amusement, kind of lampoonishness, and then social criticism, or whatever that heavier thing is.
The way we understood it and invented it wasn't just going to be a humor magazine like humor pieces in the New Yorker writ large. It was going to be this alloy of journalism, investigative journalism in many cases, and a humorous satirical take on the subjects, mostly, almost entirely. And so, we decided we were going to upset people on the left and the right and upset various centers of power. And for instance, again, I'll tell you what my children wouldn't understand if I tried to tell them today, the degree to which, for instance, the New York Times was not reported upon. That people did not say boo about this incredibly powerful institution because it was the New York Times. Why would you criticize the New York? Why? What? And so we decided, well, there's a thing we can do that nobody else is doing, for instance, and other centers of power. Our motto that we invented before we even had a magazine was smart, fun, funny, fearless. So those are all, and that really was what we tried to do, and sometimes succeeded and sometimes didn't.
Should we say that there was something about that age that cried out for mockery, and therefore SPY was that was its moment?
Well, I think that was its moment, and I think there was something about the post-'60s moment. Part of the anti-establishmentarianism, anti-establishment feeling of the '60s produced the National Lampoon and SPY and David Letterman and all of this kind of irony industrial complex.
Because you're undermining institutions as
yes,
well. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that we had this, we who started it, and we had an audience of people who had sort of had grown up in a time when mocking one's elders and betters and superiors and establishment was a thing one did. And we just took it in this direction rather than trying to do anything important or consequential.
So there were times when people said, SPY magazine is taking a hammer to, defenseless bunnies or something that
once or twice.
So were there cases where, I don't know, you felt then or you feel in retrospect that kind of spirit of gleeful going after people led you astray?
A couple of times, and I don't think we would have been doing our job if we hadn't done that a couple of times, probably. That, to go close to the line and take those risks, inevitably you're going to go over the line sometimes. However, I will say that we were very careful. I mean, so much of what we were doing was, should we really do that? Is this person or this thing that they did really so terrible? Or are we doing overkill? That was a constant conversation that we had in the office, to people's great surprise. It wasn't just like, let it rip, and without thinking. And it was a monthly magazine. Kids, there used to be monthly magazines. We had time to try to get it right and to consider, should we do this, should we not do this, should this be a little thing rather than a big thing, as opposed to, the 24/7 internets. If you have this snarky take on life, you have to do that 10 times a day, every day. And so we had, I think, the great luxury of firing muskets instead of, machine guns.
So then you went on to New York Magazine. So New York Magazine, obviously, that's a big, powerful machine. It's not counterculture, it's the culture. So did you do that just because it was a great offer, and who in the world would say no to such a great offer?
And I thought that it had been a great magazine, and I thought I could make it a great magazine in a new way. And no, it wasn't. It was. I mean, I didn't go directly from Spy to It.
Yeah.
I returned to Time for a year or two. No, it just seemed like fantastic job to sort of get this beautiful. I thought of it at the time. Somebody's going to give me this beautiful, old, 20-year-old, 25-year-old townhouse, and I could renovate it and as I wished.
Did you feel like you were able to carry out your vision?
For the 2 years and
Yeah.
8 months I was permitted to carry out my vision, I thought it was pretty good, yeah.
But so you also ran afoul of the boss.
I did run afoul. Well, not of the boss.
The owner.
Of the owner.
Yeah,
The
worse.
bosses said, don't pay no attention to the owner.
The owner is Henry Kravis.
And
so-
we'll take care of that. Just, you're doing great. Do what you're doing. Here's a raise. Great, I thought. And Mr. Kravis had me over to breakfast and said, you know, you really shouldn't be covering Wall Street anymore in New York Magazine. I said, it's New York Magazine. I mean, it kind of has to sometimes cover Wall Street, sir. And our breakfast ended pleasantly, it seemed.
Was he an intimidating presence? Is he a formidable presence?
Sure.
Especially when he owns your magazine.
Yeah, but again, the interesting kind of complicated ethical set of issues there was that my actual boss and bosses were saying, no. We're your bosses.
Yeah.
He's just this big investor in the company. Don't pay any attention. Until they decided that they
Bring the hammer down.
had to pay attention. Yeah.
Was it a specific article?
No.
Or it was like just the accumulation of writing about his friends?
It's a good question. I don't know,
Yeah.
and only he and God know that, I suppose. But we had run a cover story about Felix Rohatyn and Stephen Ratner, who were I guess,
Rivals of each other, I
yeah,
guess.
and that I know was inconvenient for them, and this may not have had it, may or may not, but for the story, it's good. The week before I was fired, we ran it was during the 1996 presidential election, and we ran a picture of newly nominated Bob Dole on the cover with his eyes closed. It was a real photograph. It was just a photograph of Bob Dole with his eyes closed. And I don't know if I knew at the time, but Henry Kravis was his national finance chair, so that may not have been.
In case he was looking for the right pretext, maybe that's what he found it in. You then began writing fiction.
I did. I thought, okay, I've always wanted to write novels, as half the journalists in America have always wanted to write novels, and now I've got this modest, essentially a year's severance, and I've just turned 40, and it's now or never.
The third one, especially, which is called True Believers, which fairly recently came out in paperback, and which is really a wonderful novel, and I urge you all to read it, kind of loops back to what we were talking about in the beginning, because at least some aspect of it, I assume, is trying to think your way into something which seems unfathomable, which is to say this young woman who comes very close to committing a terrible act, that shows its inevitability to her. It seems unfathomable to us from the outside. She's driven to it in a way that is completely, to her, seems unavoidable.
And she's a person like us.
Like us, right. Right. So in a way, I thought this is kind of a way of trying to think through the 60s. How is it that this extremeness came to seem obligatory to a whole generation of people?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And I was 13 and 14 in 1968, so as you say, a witness, a kind of marveling witness to older siblings and the rest of the world going nuts in the various ways it was going nuts. But I had never thought it through from the point of view of, okay, somebody more or less like me, who would have found themselves in this vortex of extremity, of the extremity of this war, of her friends potentially being drafted to fight in the war, of all of it, and being raised as this kind of good Catholic liberal girl who had to do the right thing in life. So yeah, thinking that through and thinking, I mean, those moments are pretty rare in history in countries and cultures where ordinary people are driven to extremes, and that was really interesting to me, since we certainly haven't had such a thing since.
It struck me when reading it that this particular American style of purity, naivete, self-righteousness, extremeness, excusing yourself in advance, feels a lot like the moment we're in terms of the right.
Yep.
And so it's striking that the Tea Party, first of all, they're grown-ups. The people you were writing about had the excuse that they're 19, 20 years old. So you now find these left gestures, styles of thinking, extremists among adults.
Absolutely. No, and in fact, I have the main character, the narrator of True Believers, say at one point, she wonders if the Tea Party types the ones of her age are in some measure people who didn't go crazy like she and her friends did in 1968 and are just now getting it out before they die. So no, it is. It is remarkably that way. And I think of the other day I thought of an alternative history of, okay, what if in 1970 and 1972, 39, new left Congress people had been elected and shut down the government if the war didn't end right then? How would that have worked out? And it is in so many ways that, except as you say, they're not kids.
But I mean, to go to your point, the left never had political power. They had all this blackmail power, moral power, etc.
Street
power. But the fact that, I mean, I take it says something about this country that at that left moment, it was kind of unimaginable to actually have people like that in a position of formal political power.
Yeah.
Whereas you now have, whether symmetrical or not, people on the far right who have extraordinary formal political power.
Correct. What's interesting is that in succession, I mean, I would argue the left the left was successful in so many ways. I mean, if you took a person from the left in 1970 and said, okay, we're going to have an African American president, Vietnam won the war, marijuana is legal, abortion is legal, and just go down the list. It's like, whoa, I guess it worked out okay 40 years later. And similarly now, or not similarly, weirdly, somethingly now, the right, starting around 1980, was successful. I mean, we are all Reaganites now, and we are all free marketeers now. And now they are overreaching in a way, arguably, that, the remnants of the left overreached during the 70s before
a hopeful thought.
Before the Democratic Party was Clinton.
Aren't conservatives still, to some extent, relitigating the 60s? This sense of who owns the culture?
Yes.
So in that sense, I mean, because the 60s, in that cultural sense, did win, that's profoundly, I think, insulting to
Well, they won in the cultural sense. They lost in the economic sense.
Yeah, right.
Or, as I argued and made people unhappy in the New York Times last summer, that basically they're flip sides of the same coin of extreme liberty won starting in the late 60s, and people who wanted to make money any way they could and as much as they could, they won that right, just as people who wanted to get high and sleep with whomever they wanted won that right. So
it's libertarian on both sides.
Correct.
Cultural libertarian
Correct.
versus economic libertarian, and that's the point of fusion, in effect.
Yeah, and it was a kind of unspoken grand bargain. You get to make a lot of money and increase inequality. We get to live as we want.
My question is essentially to find out what you think or what comes to mind when you hear the word Snowden or the name Snowden. And are there certain ethical implications in terms of the media houses that are presiding over the steady drip of intelligence information?
That's a great question. First of all, I think Edward Snowden should be Times Man of the Year, Person of the Year, for there to have been an individual and to have more ongoing effect of consequence than he. I can't remember when that's taken place. Certainly, and somebody who isn't a political leader. So that's one thing I think is, then there are the questions, I mean, and I've thought a lot about this, of Snowden versus Bradley Manning and the different ethical matrices in which they respectively existed and did what they did. The short answer to what I think of Edward Snowden is, I'm glad he did it, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't be prosecuted.
So wait, that's interesting. So, I mean, do you think what he ought to have done was face the music, basically?
I ought to have done. I mean, he's dealing with his life. Who am I to say what he ought to have done? I don't know what he ought to have done. I'm not saying what he should have done. I'm saying that I think the United States government has no choice but to attempt to prosecute him. Do I hope he gets away? Maybe. Do I think he should go to jail for years and years? No. Just because what he's done may be more good than bad in its effects, that doesn't mean like, okay, fine, you're a hero, we're going to let you go. I think, people who even, whistleblowers and whatever version of that he is, I think people who do those things need to understand that a price will be paid.
But it is interesting how I think the kind of opinion on him has shifted, that the initial response from the kind of elite class was, this is beyond the pale. And the more he has affected the world we live in, the more stuff that's come out, the more invaluable the revelations now feel like.
And again, unlike, say, Bradley Manning, it wasn't this gigantic, indiscriminate dump.
Right.
And he, had the wisdom to choose to deal with The Guardian as opposed to WikiLeaks, so there are all kinds of different. But the opinion I just said has been my opinion, for better or worse, from the beginning.
When you're setting up a magazine or a radio station, you're not just creating an institution, you're creating a whole community. And I guess I'm curious how the design of the institution affects the design of the community and essentially the entire culture at large. What are the lessons that you think should be learned as we think about creating a more powerful, mainstream, pragmatic community in America today?
Well, those are a lot of questions.
Yeah, that got big right at the end there. They got really big.
I don't know about how to make America better. I do think, however, at least the institutions I've been involved with, when they work best, have something of are benign cults, I would say. I mean, I think successful organizations, at least when they're beginning, and I've never been at one longer. As I say, this radio show now 12 years old is the oldest one I've ever been at. Need a kind of cultish missionary zeal. Now, cult has a bad odor. Whether it's Apple computers or the 2008 Obama campaign, they're all cultish, but I think are important ways, which is to say, people understand the mission. They don't backbite very much. It's all for the good of the cause. So, as creepy as that may sound, I think that's important. And now then, of course, it should be benignly managed and operated. Don't complain about a thing. Either fix it or your situation within it, or leave. Don't be a whiny complainer within a thing. And I think that I would extend to America at large. Not love it or leave it, but enough with pointless whiny complaints just to hear yourself whine and complain.
Given your viewpoint of culture, has the definition of ethics changed over time due to technology? So, like, let's take music. Downloads, there's a definite distinction between younger generations about downloading music, changing files, even, sharing books.
Yeah.
If so, what do we need to do, if anything, about that change?
Well, it's the whole thing of stealing or sharing music and books and everything is a really interesting modern example, because it's wrong. And I believe that that for the most part, people, young and otherwise, who do that blithely are kind of exempting themselves from any ethical responsibility to make an artist be able to earn her living, and are using the fact of the new technology and, well, it can't be stopped and information wants to be free and all that stuff as a way of giving themselves a waiver to whatever ethical obligations to pay for things. It's a new condition, this 24/7 political silo electronic media thing. I understand and I recognize that it's new, and you don't want to, stop the healthy sharing of stuff and hybridization of culture but so it becomes a matter of A, making it easy to do the right thing, as Apple provided with iTunes, and B, people parents with children and all of the ways in which ethics are inculcated say, don't do that. And so I think it's a great, it has been a kind of, not a, it's a kind of everyday real world test of ethical obligations and again, and as I say, I know there are people with considered and thoughtful, Lawrence Lessig, for instance, arguments about why everything I'm saying is nonsense. But my basic, feeling, and I think it would be true even if I weren't somebody who created content for pay, is that it is to just ignore the ethical aspects of that, which is what most people who do so in the real world are doing, rather than reading Lawrence Lessig and decided, oh, this man makes a point, I'm going to steal. I think is unfortunate and wrong and selfish.
I mean, I think you can all see that Kurt can't say an uninteresting thing, whatever you ask him. So it was just great, and thank you so much.
My pleasure.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.